Hello and welcome to an introduction to programming using Visual Basic exercises for beginners. In this exercise, we are going to calculate projectile motion. We are to write a program to provide information on the height of a ball thrown straight up into the air. The program should request as input the initial height in feet and the initial velocity, which is feet per second. We are to determine the maximum height of the ball. That is determined by the v divided by 32, or velocity divided by 32. Next, we should determine approximately when the ball will hit the ground. There's a hint. We are to calculate the height after every 1 second and determine when the height is no longer a positive number. And third, we are to display a table showing the height of a ball every quarter second for 5 seconds or until it hits the ground. Here's some calculation we'll be using. H, which is the height, plus v multiplied by t, or velocity times time, minus 16 times t to the power of 2, and that's in feet. And here's the form. We have 3 buttons, one for each of the calculations, and 2 text boxes for the input, one that takes the initial height and one that takes the initial velocity. And we have a list box that will output the calculations. So here I am in Visual Studio 2015. Let's start coding. And the first thing, I'm going to start with the quit. So I'll double click the quit button, go to the button click event, and I'll do me.close just to get it out of the way. The next, we can start with the actual calculations. So let's start with the determine maximum height button. Now to perform any calculation, we need to validate the input first. So I'm going to declare a variable h and v, which is of course for the height and velocity, and I'm going to create a sub-procedure that will validate the input. Now to validate the input, I need to pass the text box values, which is the velocity and height, into the validate input as arguments. However, I'm going to pass them by reference, so that way I can assign values to them straight into the validate input sub-procedure, and it will change in the calling sub-procedure. So now I can validate the input simply by checking if the user entered a number. So I will use the isNumeric, and if it is, I can assign values from the text boxes to these h and v variables. So if those values are numeric, my h will equal cdbl, we have to convert it to a double, from the text box initial height.text, and the v, or the velocity, will equal the cdbl of the text box for the initial velocity. Now, if any of those values is not numeric, we can display an error message informing the user that the input is invalid. Alright, so that's our validate input sub-procedure. Again, because we are passing these variables by reference, assigning them over here will assign the same values to them from the calling sub-procedure. So we can call the validate input and pass the h and v to them as arguments. And if they pass, the values will be assigned to them from the text boxes that are being assigned in the validate input sub-procedure. So now, after we validate the input, we can perform the calculation. We are going to use the formula h plus v multiplied by t, which is time, minus 16 times t to the power of 2. Now we don't have the t value for the maximum height. However, if you look back in the hint or the note, it says that the ball reaches the maximum height after v, velocity, divided by 32. In other words, that is our time. So I'm going to create a function. I'll call it height of the ball, and it will return a double. It will return the height, and like I said, we need to pass the h and v as well as t for the time to this function in order to perform the calculation. So now I'm going to perform the calculation simply kind of abstract without using any numbers. The numbers will be passed as arguments into this function. This function simply returns the result of the h plus v multiplied by t minus 16 times t to the power of 2. So t to the power of 2 is t times t. So this is the formula from the exercise. So now we can come up here after we validated the input and call this function and get the result for the maximum height. So I will create a variable called maximum height, and we are going to call the height of the ball function. So it expects three arguments. The first one is the h for the height, next one is velocity, and the last one is the time, which, as we saw, is the velocity divided by 32. So we will pass the calculation v divided by 32 as the argument for the time. So now when we have our maximum height, we can display the result into our list box simply using the items.add. The first thing I'm going to display is the header, just so we know what we are displaying. And next thing, we can display the actual number. So it's going to be the maximum height. So this is our maximum height sub-procedure. Now we can go to our form and let's do the determine approximate time until ball hits the ground. So the first thing I'm going to do, just like before, I'm going to validate the input and make sure that the user entered a number into the height and velocity. So I'm going to declare variables h and v just like we did before. And we are going to call the validate input sub-procedure and pass the h and v. Again, these are by reference, so the values will change in our validate input, or they will be assigned, and we will have the values for them in our button click event here. So now to perform the calculations, we are going to need a loop, and I'm going to do all of it in a function. So I'm going to create a function called time to hit, and we need to pass the h and v to it as arguments, and the function will return a double. It will return the time. Alright, so if you look at the assignment, to determine approximately when the ball hits the ground, we should calculate the height after every 0.1 second and determine when the height is no longer a positive number. In other words, we are going to be looping as the ball is in the air by checking the height of the ball function, and if the return value from this function is greater than 0, we'll keep looping, and when it hits less than 0, we'll exit the loop and we will return the time that accumulated within the loop. So we are going to declare a variable for the time, and the initial value will be 0. The next thing is to loop. So we will do the do while, and we are looping constantly through the height of the ball function, passing the h, v, and the time is the value that actually keeps changing. So if the return value is greater than 0, we will be looping and adding the time plus equals 0.1. So the time keeps changing, and the height of the ball keeps returning different value each time it's being called until it hits negative value. Then we will exit the loop and we will return t for the time. So now we can come back to our approximate time button click event. After we validated the input, we can create a variable as double, and we will call the time to hit function, and we will pass the h and v as arguments. That will give us the time, and we can now display the result. Again, I'm going to display the header first. That will simply say that the ball will hit the ground approximately and display the t value into our list box. Alright, so here's my output for the list box. Now we can go and do the display table. And just like we did before, we are going to declare some variables and call the validate input function. So I'm going to create h and v as double, and I'm going to validate them. Alright, so to show the table, I'm going to create a sub-procedure, and the sub-procedure of course needs h and v, and it's a sub-procedure so it doesn't return any value. And I'm going to create variable for the time, and I'm going to create a header for the list box that will have two columns, one for the time and one for the height. And I'm just putting some spaces in between so it's formatted as two columns. So now I'm going to initialize my t to 0, just like we did with the previous one when we calculated the approximate time. And I'm going to calculate the height of the ball, and I'm going to call the function height of the ball, just like we did before, and assign it to a value of the height. So I'll create a dim height and call the function. And I'm going to pass the h, v, and time to it as arguments. So now, since we are creating a table of two columns, we need to do a little loop. I'm going to do loop until, and we are going to loop until the time is over 5 seconds. if you look at the assignment, it says we are supposed to display 5 seconds. So we will do loop until our time is greater than 5. Once it reaches more than 5 seconds, we'll stop. Or we also need to make sure that the height is not less than 0. If it is, then there's no reason for us to loop because the ball is on the ground. That's one of the conditions that the assignment asks us to do. 5 seconds or until it hits the ground. So within our loop, we are going to display the result. So we will do, and I'm going to display some spaces just like we have for the headers. And the first thing I'm going to display is the time. So I'll concatenate t dot toString, and I'll make it a number with 2 decimal places. So I'll just make it n. By default, it's 2 decimal places. And I'm gonna concatenate the height with some spaces in between. And the height will be toString as well. And this time we can have 1 decimal place. So now our time needs to be increased, and if you look at the assignment again, it says that we are displaying a table showing the height of the ball every quarter of the second. So we will simply increase it by 0.25. t plus equals 0.25. And we will call the height again. The first one is just the initial height. Now within the do loop, the height keeps changing, and that's actually what we are displaying. So we will call the height equals, and we'll call the same function. So the height of the ball, and pass the h, v, and the new time to it. And you can see I have this underline. There's an error because I have a loop, but I'm actually looping until if I got a keyword. So that will fix the underline. Alright, so now we can call the sub procedure from our button click event for the table. And just like before, once the button is clicked, I'm going to clear the list box first. And after we validate the input, I'm gonna call the show table sub procedure and pass the h and v to it as arguments. Alright, so this is all the code. Let's run it. So if I do 5 for the initial height and 34 for the initial velocity, I'll click determine maximum height, and it says the maximum height is 23.0625 feet. If I click determine approximate time, it says the ball will hit the ground. Oh, it's cutting the text because the list box is a little too small, but it calculates it as 2.3 seconds. And if I click display table, here's my time and height, and I have it spaced out a little too far, but you can see that for the time and height, the corresponding values like this. And if I click quit, then it quits. So I'm going to just make those quick fixes. The first thing, I'm going to decrease the spacing here, and the header for the approximate time, I'm going to split it into 2 lines. So I made the changes. As you can see, I decreased the spacing, and now I also split the lines. Let's run it again and see if it formats better. So 5 and 34, maximum height, so that stays the same. Now it splits the lines, and it's still the same 2.3 seconds, and display table now displays nicely in the list box. So this is now working correctly. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you in the next video.